Stop murmuring among yourselves. Why do Jesus' listeners grumble and complain? Because they're annoyed. They disagree with claims that Jesus is making. Is he, quote, the living bread that came down from heaven? How can he, the son of Joseph and Mary, come down from heaven? How can a popular rabbi claim to be more than just another mortal human being? People do not pretend to turn into bread, do they? What is he asking of them? Jesus is asking them to believe in something that no one can prove. And that's the essence of belief. To commit yourself and myself to something that is real, is true, it's there, just can't prove it. So it's a risk. If they believe that he can transform himself into bread, they will just have to take his word for it then. And most of them refuse to believe that Jesus is claiming about himself, even though he says they shall all be taught by God. Why does Jesus claim then to be living bread from heaven? He tells them, this is the living bread that comes down from heaven for a man to eat and never die. He's talking about permanent eternal death. Jesus is pushing things a bit too far, though, for most of the audience. As Jews, they all knew the past. They knew the great Elijah episode where this holy prophet in extreme conditions is nourished by God to continue on a little bit of food to survive his desert experience, his fleeing his persecutors, to go on and go on, because what he has to do is to give life through his prophecy. The Jews also knew from Moses that God did send down manna from heaven. It was an earthly way to make them survive in the great desert crossing for 40 years. He says, my Father, though, will give you bread from heaven, not like Moses did. For a man to eat and never die, it will give life to the world. It's almost as if he's recreating the human race again, overcoming death with a solution. This is very different from what they had been taught before Jesus speaks. Jesus can become bread? You could say, yes, that's what he's claiming, but no, he's claiming more than that. He's saying the bread that I will give isn't bread at all. It's my flesh for the life of the world. All that transformation and mutation is going on. And he works in the past and the present. He's about to do something amazing. So it is really more than bread he's talking about. What appears to be bread, even to this event tonight in this Mass, is not bread. It is the flesh of Jesus Christ, who rose from the dead in that human body. And it's the power to give to us that same risen body, that life, through the simple appearance of a flimsy wafer that's no longer a flimsy wafer. And he's asking us to believe that. Jesus was preparing his audience for the miracle, not of the loaves and fishes, we had that 2 weeks ago, but for the miracle that would happen the night before he dies, the Last Supper miracle, a Passover meal. If God could feed their ancestors with manna in the desert, and he did, they admit it, if Jesus could multiply loaves and fishes to feed more than 5,000 people in one episode and at one time, could Jesus do even more than that? It is not that Jesus will change himself, though, into bread. That's not the point, but the other way around. He will turn bread into himself, that a man could eat and never die. For as he adds, for my flesh is real food, my blood real drink. Someday, when we are permitted to return the reception of communion from the chalice, then the fullness of the sign is there. We receive his body and his blood. Although when you receive the sacred host, you are receiving both species on either form anyway. It's the one Christ. Why would anyone then ever complain about such a miracle? That God could take bread and make it identical to himself, not as a symbol, but as a reality. Why did the crowds murmur and grumble? Why were they annoyed? And there's the answer. Perhaps because Jesus was asking too much of belief. When people believe, it's a good thing, but they sometimes set limits to how far they're willing to be committed to what you're asking of them. And that happens through all of life. I use often the example that I'm most familiar with is in matrimony. When a man and woman choose to marry, they're making a decision, they're making an active belief in two things. And number one, in the person they're going to spend the rest of their life with, whom they don't know completely, and they can't predict the future, so it's a risk, a belief. They're also putting their belief in the fact that I want to be married. I want to spend my life with someone all the time as my life partner. Not everybody can do this or wants that. So we have that experience always. But sometimes Jesus is pushing it too far for some people in this gospel. And that's the situation from the beginning of the church that we are in 2,000 years ago to this very night. For many Christians, they can manage to believe in some things like, oh, I can believe that God exists, okay? I can believe that God who exists created the heavens and the earth. It's like walking through the creed. Yes, they can. And they can even manage to believe that God who created everything became a human being. Born of Mary, many Christians celebrate Christmas. God became human. Son of God, Son of Mary. They can even go higher and believe in the very unscientific event that this Jesus, God and man, once he was put to death and buried, he rose in his human body. So people celebrate Easter, not just Christmas, in these fantastic events that are well beyond science and are not provable by any evidence except by the convictions of one's belief. You invest yourself in what you're believing. But somehow there are many Christians who find it impossible, and including some Catholics, impossible to believe that in the Lord's Supper, which we call simply the Mass or the Holy Eucharist, that Jesus can change this very simple unleavened bread and wine into his very self, his own body and blood. And why is that? Why do people often find that impossible? Well, the answer is very obvious, starting with ourselves here. Just look around you here in the church tonight. I include people watching on the live stream. There are many of us here in this church watching from homes. The question is, why are you here? Why are you participating in this liturgy? Because you and I are, like in the gospel, the ones who do believe. Jesus explains it this way of why you're here. He says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. So the reason you came to Mass is for many good reasons. You were trained to do this. The commandments urge it. The very beginnings of the church, they always broke the Lord's bread on a Sunday, somewhere in someone's home, long before churches, on the day of the resurrection, Sunday, Saturday evening. There it is. And so they do this as the observance, but also because the Father has prompted them. That's the answer. We are here partaking of the real presence of Jesus Christ because the Father in heaven has called you and me to this. The Father has attracted us to his Son and in fact made it a habit and a virtue in our religious life. He did it by an act of grace. Grace, gratia in Latin, means gift. He gave a gift. He didn't force us, didn't use any guilt on us. He invited us to enjoy his life, to share in his life through his Son, who has to become some kind of form of food to unite himself perfectly with us in his flesh and blood, his risen life. So yes, the Father has drawn us. He has attracted us here. And we are here because we are convinced of his gift to us. We want this gift. We are the ones who believe it is real, the real presence of God in our midst here, which is why all liturgical and ritual actions are centered around this bread of life. The tabernacle, where the Eucharist is reserved throughout the week, a little candle burns beside it as a sign of respect. The room becomes a different kind of room than the shopping malls or the marketplace. It's a holy place to pray and to contemplate the one person who centers us in his life and fills the room with his presence. Therefore, we never can judge those who are not here. It's not our business to examine other people's consciences for whatever reason, whether they're sick or they're afraid or simply they lapsed from the faith. Nor do we judge our fellow Christians of other denominations who 500 years ago do not accept what we have always accepted from the beginning with the apostles, the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And there's a lot of discussion in the dialogues with fellow Christians. So they deny this and reduce it to a symbol From this gospel we just heard, we must believe, though, that they are all still being called by the Father. Whether they're here or not, whether they are interested or not, God never ceases to call and invite. He's not choosy. But for some reason or another, they do not hear the call. Or perhaps, like this gospel, they hear it, they can't believe what they're hearing, and they refuse the invitation. And as what Deacon said the other day, stay tuned, because 2 weeks from tonight, this quarrel gets very bitter, okay? So that's going to happen. It's not over yet. This is the center, the Eucharist centers the faith, because it is Christ, not just a symbol of him. It's a Christ who feeds people who need us. We are the Elijahs in the desert. We need the Lord to nourish us as we continue on our way through life, doing his will, and also building up in us the character of the resurrection, which was promised to us in our baptisms. For this reason, we celebrate every week on this night or Sunday this gift that will one day raise us up to end its life. In one of the prayers at the altar table, the priest says, when we receive communion, we are swallowing a foretaste of what we shall later become in the future in its fullness. That's astounding. You know, it causes us to be contemplative about how substantial this is, how good it is, and how we prepare ourselves to take part in this. And we also pray all the time in the liturgy. You can hear that in the Eucharistic prayer before the great Amen, when the priest singles off and prays for all our brothers and sisters everywhere who are missing, who are absent, or who don't yet believe in this, that one day they will realize what they are missing, and by God's grace, perhaps our example in prayers, they will find their way to this one table of salvation, the banquet of our future life.